I am neither a birder nor a photographer. I have long been fascinated by all manner of wildlife native to suburban Lake County where I live. The reclusive nocturnal animals, in particular, have drawn my attention as sightings are infrequent and often fleeting. I never suspected that a wild creature living near my home, a predator of the night, could touch me so deeply and similarly enter the lives of many other people in our neighborhood. Let me take you along on my journey with the owls. Over the years, I have occasionally heard the calls of barred owls and screech owls, as well as the timeless, familiar hooting of the great horned owls. In 2016, I became intrigued by a pair of great horned owls that apparently lived in our neighborhood. I knew they were there. For several seasons, I had heard their calls through our open bedroom window on balmy summer nights. Their haunting, resonant hoots echoed through the silence. At first, I only saw these stealthy birds during late-night dog walks. I discovered their favorite trees. At dusk, they looked back at me, feathers waving in the wind. One evening, I began filming the owls at dusk. My first crude video captured an owl glaring back at me with a piercing stare. I watched the owls bravely stand their ground when harassed by angry crows or blue jays. On some evenings, I patiently tracked the enigmatic owl and his mate. They seemed to gravitate toward one street corner, particularly favoring this stately, gnarled oak tree. One spring morning in 2017 at dawn, I trained my camera upon the tree, hoping to see one of the two owls. When I looked through my camera lens, to my astonishment, this adorable down-covered owlet was gazing back at me with a curious expression. I had serendipitously located their nest. There were two young owls, attended by both parents. The mother frequently guarded from above the nest. Soon the young owls left the nest, but remained on the old oak tree. They hopped from branch to branch, eventually learning to fly. The predatory adult owls would frequently bring back dead animals to feed their young. I saw rabbits, squirrels, and mice carried by the owls. In the late spring, all four owls flew off and left the area. The owls did not return to nest in the old oak tree for 2 years, though they appeared briefly in December 2018. But by late summer 2019, I again began to hear their hoots. In early January of 2020, one of my neighbors heard their distinctive courtship calls. The owls returned to the old oak. Throughout the winter, the female sat on the nest. Once again, the male tended to her and often roosted in a fir tree across the street. People have a natural tendency to anthropomorphize animals. My neighbor Beth named the male Hootie and the female Hattie. I watched as a new brood of 3 young owlets first appeared in the nest. But that spring, the neighborhood had changed. The COVID-19 pandemic had brought with it an eerie silence. There was almost no traffic. People were sequestered in their homes, coming out only for occasional walks, while social distancing from others. Many neighbors began to appear, as word of the owl family quickly spread over social media. Excited birdwatchers and curious gawkers came from afar to see and photograph the owls. The owls, who I had considered part of my family since 2017, had suddenly become celebrities.
She knows us all. She even knows Bentley.
Okay, so look in the open hole of the trunk of the tree. You can see the mama moving around.
Oh,
She just moved her head.
Yeah, I did. I can see that.
Hattie stood guard nearby as blue jays threatened her young. The Owl's Corner became an animated center of activity, almost a circus, during the COVID-19 shut-in. What do you think of the owls?
I think it's a nice thing to see a living thing living in a tree in a day when we're all worried about a pandemic.
It's nice when everyone has to stay home to come out and see something like this, isn't it?
Slows everything down, like life should be, really.
One evening, I told my wife Lori that I would be getting up early the next morning to photograph an owl in front of the moon. Not being an early riser, I frequently debate with myself about getting up before dawn. Mike, it's time to get up to see the owls. It's almost sunrise. What time is it? I just want to go back to sleep. If you don't get up now, we might miss something really good. Let's do this some other time. I had planned the shot carefully for a clear morning, calculating the phase and celestial position of the moon to catch the nearly full moon in the earliest light of dawn. As I was walking toward the nest, I spotted Hootie in a tree where I'd never seen him before. I returned home after only a few minutes with this picture in hand. The biggest owlet ventured out first, leaving its siblings behind in the nest. That adventurous owlet braved a late spring snowstorm, fully exposed, out on a branch. In time, all three owlets began branching, hopping progressively farther out onto the great oak limbs, while both adults brought them food and remained close by. The adult owls hunt aggressively at night. They constantly feed their brood squirrels, skunks, and rabbits. Before feeding her young, Hattie first prepares the food. Here you can see an owlet devouring an impressively large piece of an animal. Here, the owl is carrying a mouse. This looks like the hindquarters of a rabbit. It's hard to tell if this is a rabbit, or perhaps a kit fox. Note the reddish fur on the leg. She takes a bite first, then carries this freshly killed pigeon up to her young. Near the owl's tree, it's not uncommon to find a dead rabbit without a head, or a head without a body. The owls occasionally regurgitate a neat pellet of undigested fur and bones. Gray squirrels, though sometimes eaten by the owls, as we can see here, amazingly live in harmony with the owls in the trees. A surprising symbiosis, apparently based on some less than obvious interdependence, must drive this seemingly paradoxical cohabitation. This squirrel's nest fell to the ground in a March windstorm. It had been located on the oak tree here, mere inches from the owl's nest. As a pair of squirrels climb in a nearby tree, Hootie simply watches. Here are two examples of a squirrel boldly climbing right next to an adult owl. On this occasion, a fluffy young owlet is also in the nest. Hattie follows the squirrel as it climbs above. On a spring afternoon in 2020, one of the owlets fell, fluttering to the ground far below. Some onlookers needed to be restrained so as not to intercede as the small owl scrambled into some bushes. The fate of the fallen bird, still too young to fly, concerned all of us. Almost miraculously, after spending several days in this nearby small tree attentively fed by its parents, the young owl returned to the immense oak and climbed up the tree to rejoin its two siblings. This auspicious resurrection inspired one neighbor to publish an illustrated children's book depicting the incredible survival journey of the young owlet. Eventually, all three owlets successfully fledged, and by midsummer, the entire owl family had left our neighborhood. Understandably, I'd become emotionally attached to these almost magical creatures whose powerful presence had impressed so many of us in our neighborhood. Through the summer and early fall of 2020, I watched for the owls, hoping for their return. As the pandemic's toll became more evident, we all sensed the loss of so much in our lives. In November, I heard sporadic hooting in the night. By late December 2020, amid the frequent courtship calls, Hootie and Hattie displayed renewed interest in the old tree hollow, occasionally landing there. Hattie began to sit on the nest. This time, they carefully lined the entrance to the nest with dried leaves. That winter, we experienced a series of Arctic blasts of below-zero temperatures, accompanied by blizzards of fierce wind and snow. She remained unflappable, always displaying phenomenal patience and endurance. Hootie brought her dead skunks and rabbits to eat. For weeks, I never saw her leave the nest. Look carefully here. Only her feather tufts, known as plumicorns, protrude through the snow. Too much time seemed to pass. The expected 5-week incubation period had long expired. I suspected that the brood was non-viable. Hattie continued her vigil. Then, a hopeful sign. She seemed to shift to the front of the nest, as though something were inside. Finally, a small, fluffy head appeared. Witnessing new life once again was the tonic for this gloomy period. Before long, a second owlet appeared. There was no third hatchling this year, but one egg, with a stunted fetus inside, fell from the nest along with the empty shells of the two surviving owlets. The adult owls hunted more aggressively, constantly feeding the brood with skunks, rabbits, and even a small fox kit. I'm not sure why I find the owls to be so endearing, despite their aggressive predatory behavior. Once, they appeared to be eating someone's pet cat, though I was never quite certain. On this morning, Hattie displays her vigilance, defending her owlets. At first, she pays attention to the traffic below. Watch her remarkable eyes. Next, a robin threatens her with loud calls. Then a mob of crows arrives. She assumes a more secure defensive position, directly above the nest. She alternately looks up at the danger and down at the owlets. It's all part of a routine day's work for a mother owl. Though the adult owls are not threatened by any predators in our area, they have evolved a magnificent, spectacular plumage that also provides astonishing camouflage. Note the chevron pattern in the feathers matching the pattern of the wood. The striations of her breast perfectly blend with the adjacent wood markings. The plumicorns mimic the bark and surrounding wood. When the owl is wet, her body is completely hidden against the tree. It requires little imagination to see a pattern on the back wall of the nest cavity that closely resembles the face of a great horned owl. I like to think that it's a portrait of the owl's ancestor hanging on their bedroom wall. As the small birds rapidly grew, dark feathers appeared along their wings, and they quickly approached the size of mature owls. The first owlet to hatch was larger than its sibling. Hattie always kept an eye on her two owlets, sometimes from a nearby tree. The larger owlet left the nest first. Hootie and Hattie both continued to deliver dismembered animal parts to satisfy the young owl's voracious appetites. One day later, the second owlet clumsily began to climb out of the nest as well. But they were unsteady on their feet and only beginning to test their wings. At that point, I was once again greatly heartened by the owl's success as our worldwide pandemic dragged on interminably. After both young owls climbed out onto a limb, one of them fell to the ground. This was all too familiar, though none of us saw it happen this time. My neighbors and I were optimistic because of the amazing resurrection of the lost owl the previous year. That evening, my neighbor Beth and I went out to look for the fallen owl and to see what the adults were doing. Just after dark, both adults were flying around frantically, looking confused and distressed. We watched the male owl bring a freshly killed squirrel to the female, who then took it to the remaining owlet on the branch of the tree. As we walked toward the female and watched her in the tree, she suddenly swooped down and flew directly over our heads, letting out a horrifying, blood-curdling shriek, unlike anything we had ever heard before from an owl. It was impossible not to feel the anguish of this bird who had worked so hard to nurture her brood throughout the winter. It was totally heartbreaking. One of the most poignant moments either Beth or I have ever experienced. The next morning, we returned to see if the lost bird had reappeared. The news was worse. Both owlets were dead. The second hatchling had fallen as well. It was not clear whether they had died from injuries or if they had been killed by other animals. Hattie remained near for a few days, searching for her missing owlets. This was not the uplifting antidote to the pandemic that I had envisioned. Survival in nature is a constant struggle for all creatures. It wasn't just me. All of our neighbors were affected deeply by the news. This was simply one more loss befitting the era of COVID-19. In the fall of 2021, I hoped that the owls would return. Though selfishly I wanted to watch them, I also wished that they might find a safer place for raising a new brood. Once again in November, the owls returned to the neighborhood. By December, courtship calling between the owls became more frequent and sustained than in any previous year. One night, I heard a competing male owl trying to invade Hootie's territory from the north. I called him Vladimir Hootin. He flew off into the night. Hootie and Hattie continued their magnificent hootenanny night after night. Finally, I was able to hear the distinctive mating whistles on 2 occasions and captured this recording amid some background noise. During the last week in January, Hattie moved into the old nest. She seemed to keep a cache of food in the back corner of the nest. The nest cavity had deepened, enabling her to sit in a lower, more protected position within the hollow than in previous years. Hootie found a few favorite day roosts, always within sight of the nest. The owls faced frigid winter weather, a bird flu outbreak, tree trimmers with chainsaws pruning the nest tree, and a windstorm that sent a loose section of bark and a squirrel's nest with its baby squirrels tumbling to the ground. The first fluffy little head appeared in the nest. We experienced a drenching spring. Even Hattie looked a bit bedraggled. After this loud van drives by, you can hear Hattie barking out a warning. The cold, wet, and snowy weather continued. Eventually, I could clearly see two babies in the nest cavity. In this longer sequence, you can appreciate just how attentive Hattie is to her young. Her feathered legs and sharp talons are clearly visible. She must be extremely cautious stepping into the nest to avoid injuring the owlets. She has just fed the rapidly growing young owls. Amid the loud traffic at the corner, she takes a part of a rabbit upstairs to eat herself. As these owlets mature, the distinctive plumicorns that give great horned owls their name gradually appear. Owls carefully preen their plumage, as Hattie is doing here. Being a pilot myself, I'm fascinated by the owl's specialized aerodynamic adaptations for night hunting. Their broad wings are ideal for very slow gliding flight to stealthily approach their prey. Even the feathers have evolved remarkable features for silent flight, enabling the owls to hear animals in the dark and to approach without being heard. This is a left secondary flight feather from one of the owls. The trailing edge has a delicate fringe, which silences flight. The leading edge of each flight feather is lined with comb-like fimbria, which also moderate local turbulence and wind noise. This velvety surface absorbs sound and simultaneously decreases friction between adjacent wing feathers. However, I must leave this beautiful plume behind, as surprisingly, mere possession of any native migratory bird feathers is a federal offense. As in previous years, the young owls left the nest and began branching on the tree. Hattie always stayed nearby. This year, for several days, both youngsters would occasionally return to the safety of the nest before leaving for good. Some exceptionally windy spring days had me worried that an owlet might fall again. Hattie watched them like a hawk. Well, actually, like an owl. The repetitive head circling is said by some to help as they acquire visual depth perception. Their beautiful wing plumage grew quickly. The owlets sometimes preened one another. Despite my fear of a repeat tragedy, I was thrilled as the youngsters instinctively taught themselves to fly. Hattie watched from a nearby tree. This year, I was elated to see that Hattie, Hootie, and two healthy owlets successfully left the area for parts unknown. Even though I'm not a hunter, I've concluded that I identify with the owls, and that's what draws me to them. In the owls, I see a reflection of myself and other human beings. We work hard to care for our families. We contend with successes and losses, hard times and good times. As a species, We are infinitely more violent and destructive than these predatory great horned owls who have lived in harmony with nature right here in my neighborhood.